Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Gadara. I'm a senior editor at the New Humanitarian. And we're here essentially to discuss about the ethical challenges that come with covering humanitarian crisis. The New Humanitarian we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And we've been covering crisis. We were set up in 1995 after the Rwanda genocide to provide better understanding of humanitarian crisis, especially for people who are interested in crisis response. So this session is actually part of a push by the New Humanitarian to get journalists to rethink how we do crisis. I think there's been lots of criticism about how communities in crisis are portrayed, about whether we actually cover crisis. There was a recently released report that showed, like, for example, in the UK, if you look at it looked at 7 public service TV channels, and on average, humanitarian crisis in the entire year only got 19 minutes. Places like Chad got nothing. So do we need to change how we see crisis, how as journalists and media we approach crisis, how we cover them? So today we're joined by 3, some former journalists, one still active, about people who have been looking who've covered crisis themselves and have been studying how crises are covered. It would be interesting to see what they think and their take about these questions. So we have Mel Barnes, who's the Deputy Dean of the School of Communication and Creativity at City University of London. She's co-authored a book called Humanitarian Journalists, Covering Crisis from a Boundary Zone, and is a leading expert on media ethics, crisis reporting, and the emerging field of humanitarian journalism. Catherine Soi is a South African correspondent for Al Jazeera. She's based in Nairobi and has spent over 2 decades covering crisis and political transitions and big stories for Al Jazeera around the continent. Jane Ferguson is probably a familiar face, as Catherine is. To all of you, she's the CEO of Newsphere, which they just launched this year. She's an award-winning journalist, and she's covered crisis for both PBS, for CNN, for a wide variety of large media institutions, and reported from conflict zones, Afghanistan. I first met her, I think, in 2010 in Somalia, so in Mogadishu. Right, so let's just get to it. And by the way, there are mics. If you have a question as you're going along, feel free to raise your hand and stuff. You don't need to wait till sort of the end to ask. Right, Jane and Catherine, let me start with you guys, because you've kind of done the work. Covering crisis and the humanity that is caught up in crisis, is it different from regular journalism? And if it is, what's the difference? Does it require a different set of either ethics or a different set of standards?
Is that?
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. I do think crises is in and of itself a unique challenge. I think that there are a whole host of ethical issues which are fairly unique to crises that every journalist, every news organization handles differently. For instance, one thing is broadcasting. I've spent much of my career in television. Broadcasting children is one thing. It's so rare in most scenarios where you end up around an incredible amount of children who are separated from their guardian. Should you film? Is this permissible? There's all sorts of other challenges as well when it comes to access to hospitals. in places where people are incredibly vulnerable. People, consent issues are much, much more common in a humanitarian crisis because people are not always in a position to do so.
Right.
And you are given this often very privileged, extraordinary access. And so I do think that those challenges are particularly unique to humanitarian crises. And that's something that is happening at the same time as an incredibly high-pressured environment where journalists are competing and they are under pressure to get stories out and to get content. And I think those things can clash at times where you've got the need to do no harm and be responsible in your approach to your work,
right.
but you also need to deliver your work on time and to a deadline. And so I think that that's a real tightrope to walk.
Right. Before Catherine answers the same question, in your memoir you speak about the challenges of filming people in a hospital, sort of in their worst state, and not being able to do anything to sort of get, to solve their problems, or to directly help them. That seems to me to be sort of a conflict that you feel as a journalist covering this. You have a background of being a sports journalist and a business journalist, which I assume this one never thinks that kind of end up in the same way. So could you speak about how you navigate those sorts of challenges, those sorts of ethical questions that might come?
Well, the incidences that I talked about in my book were very much so through the lens of being a really young reporter in my early, mid-20s, where I was kind of shocked by how repulsed I was by the fact that I was there to film people in the worst possible day of their life, like loss of a child, or struggling to find their loved ones, or they themselves dying. It's extremely difficult to do that and offer no help. Obviously we think that on a broader level, we believe in our work, that it is important and helps, but I'm not helping this person who's lying in front of me. And I'm also documenting for others their suffering. I still believe in it, I still believe it's the right thing to do, but it feels very difficult in that moment. It feels like a very complicated, morally complicated thing to do.
Yeah, exactly, and it's that moral complication I'm interested in. Catherine, when you are in places like Goma, which you've reported from, and you've seen kind of the same scale of suffering, how do you deal with it? And do you think that your journalistic education prepared you to actually deal with this sorts of ethics?
I think I'm going to talk to empathy.
Right.
How do we handle such stories? I have covered crisis, IDP, internally displaced people in different countries, refugees, people who are in various states of distress. So how do you talk to these people? And as journalists, when you get into a country like you managed the Democratic Republic of Congo, you want to get the story out in the most impactful way. And how you talk to these people is very important. I have realized that when you have somebody who comes into a country and is trying to get this interview out, say with a woman, and you're not feeling the emotions, right? So as a journalist, you start getting frustrated, right? Because there is something, you have a line, there is what you want to portray, and then sometimes you'd get frustrated, and then you start asking the same question over and over to get the answer that you need. And I think that's a very bad way to do it, because these are people, like you say, who have lost everything, right? You have to be very careful how to approach them, what to say to them, and you don't have to evoke tears, right? To make us Is that right? Okay. Yeah, you don't have to have tears to make a story impactful. So how you approach these people is very, very important. And again, the dignity. Some of these people are very resilient. Yes, they've lost their homes. Yes, they're in a refugee camp. But these are people who had their lives. So how you tell their story is very important because it has to be with dignity, right? You can't have, for example, film their kids naked, and we've seen that a lot. Things have changed, especially when it comes to Africa. We saw a lot of kids who were naked, with snot running down their noses and things like that. So just
Eyes on
death
the
and
eyes and
destruction.
things.
You know what I mean? Yes.
Right.
So that's what sometimes, especially international journalists, look for. But I'm glad that things have really changed when it comes to reporting on Africa. But the bottom line is that you have to give these people dignity,
Yeah, but
even as you're, trying to get this impact.
Yeah, but we have this image of journalism as something that stands apart. So it's, as a journalist, you're not in the story, you're not part of it, you are observing, if you will. How do you square that with what you just mentioned, the idea of empathy? Aren't you, when you try to be empathetic, sort of putting yourselves in their shoes? In which case, you're not necessarily divorced from them, and you're telling the story in a way that is already impacted by what you're seeing. Do you find that to be a question that you need to resolve?
Well, I think when it comes to activism in journalism, especially when it comes to humanitarian journalists, people who cover this kind of crisis, I think you cannot completely divorce yourself from just empathy, because you're talking about people that you have gone to cover, you have seen the evidence, you have, these refugees who are telling their stories, so there's no way you can completely de-annihilate yourself from what they're feeling, right? But you have also to maintain your objectivity, I think. But you cannot completely remove yourself from the story, I think. Right.
Mel, you've studied humanitarian journalists, you've studied the new humanitarian where I work, and how do you see them doing their work, the sorts of ethical stances that they take, or standards that they try and live up to, and how those compare to what would be traditional journalistic ethics?
Firstly, thanks for organising this panel, because I think this is just one of the most important questions we could be talking about in the future of reporting. How can we ethically report on these life and death kind of crises? So I did a project with colleagues in the UK, Martin Scott and Kate Wright, where we studied, we interviewed about 150 journalists that were covering crises, and we found that there was a kind of group, a small number of journalists that we call humanitarian journalists, who occupied a slightly different space from the conventional mainstream media, if we can still think of that as existing. And whereas conventional news norms tend to have us focusing on crises, sporadic, episodic reporting, here is something dramatic that is happening, here's a report, and still tends to, unfortunately, highlight Western lives caught up in crises. For example, people first started talking about this in earnest, I think, after the Boxing Day tsunami, where the news coverage that went around the world, I think someone said it made it look like the tsunami had hit Sweden rather than Southeast Asia, because it focused so much on these Swedish tourists who were in Southeast Asia and not the hundreds of thousands of lives. So Western conventional reporting still tends to take an approach that's almost serving a Western audience. And I'm thinking here of traditional, even public service broadcasters and newswires that we think of as being global. They still tend to take that approach. Whereas these humanitarian specialists, at a small number of organizations like the New Humanitarian, like DevX, like a couple of others, were more infused, we found, by kind of the norms of the humanitarian field. So they approached their work by thinking in terms of things like moral equivalency, that all lives should have equal representation in their reporting. We actually showed this in our work, that when you looked at how they reported on the Nepal earthquake, for example, Erin, the New Humanitarian, focused a lot more on Nepalese lives, talked to local sources. 2/3 of the reports had local sources in it. Only 1/3 of the more conventional mainstream coverage had local sources. They also focused on different topics and did more kind of follow-up reporting. Questions around resilience, how had this happened, what was the response, and highlighting local efforts as well as not just Western NGOs who had come in to try and respond to the crisis. And I'll just finish by saying they were also a bit more comfortable speaking to this issue in doing work that they felt would make a difference. So they're quite comfortable with this. It's a really interesting area to tease out because it's very ambiguous, but they were a bit more comfortable with the idea that they were reporting to do good, that their work might help the response to the crisis. It might help people in the future who were going to be responding to earthquakes, or it might help the local community find the information that they needed. They were quite distinct in that kind of set of values.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, the distinction between what humanitarian journalists do and what traditional journalist ethics requires, what are the sort of certain specific examples of this? You say, for example, in Nepal, we are interested in impact and we go out to try and get impact. Doesn't all journalism aspire towards impact? In what sense is this different?
It came through very clearly. I'll give you kind of an example of the BBC journalist we talked to who just said, straight blank, it's not okay for me to want to make a difference with my news. I have to just care about telling the story. And I don't actually believe in that distinction. As an academic studying this, I actually think it's a false dichotomy. I think that all journalism is trying to make a difference. You know, we think of the most classic forms of journalism, watchdog journalism, that's trying to hold power to account. That's got an agenda. It's a good one, but it is a normative value. So sometimes I think we overemphasize this distinction, but journalists themselves do vary in how they express that value. So some of these conventional, it's not a very useful phrase, by the way, conventional, but some of these more BBC classically trained journalists, we might say, think that they don't want to get emotionally invested and it's not okay for them to get emotionally invested and it's not okay for them to care about the outcome. And in fact, one of them said she tried not to follow, even if her stories had a big impact, helped free someone from prison, she tried to not get excited about that because that wasn't what she was there to do.
Right. Jane, when you were covering crisis, would you go in with essentially with a goal in mind? Apart from getting the story, is there a particular outcome you want from the journalism?
You know, the answer is yes, but it feels like a dirty secret because, you know, you are, like I was definitely coming from that classically trained background where you're like, well, I shouldn't be trying to move the needle. I should not be trying to impact events. I'm just here to raise awareness about them. But of course, you know, if you're a journalist who also, like, for instance, a big part of my work in conflict zones has been to cover humanitarian crises caused by conflict, and very often, you know, crimes of war that have been imposed on a civilian population. You know, I don't try to expose war crimes and then be like, well, we'll see what happens, who cares? You know, like, obviously, I want them to stop. And so, to be honest with you, there's a conflict inside of me where I don't ever want to be seen as an activist, and only because I don't want to be dismissed. I don't want my work to be cast off as, you know, bias or
if people see you as an activist, they wouldn't take your work as a journalist seriously?
Well, it can take the power away. You know, this is the difficulty. I don't have a good answer to it. What do we do instead? And, you know, credibility used to be a sense of power as a reporter. Well, if this news organization is reporting it, it's gonna be a big scandal that this has been exposed. That's dying now as the media landscape changes exponentially. But yeah, I think that it's a challenge that every journalist faces. For instance, we often, when we're off camera, feel, where is it safe to express our opinions? You know, like, I obviously think, you know, war crimes and forced starvation and all sorts of things I've covered over the years are bad, or objectively negative things I would like to stop in the world. But, you know, at what point do we start getting attacked because of our perspectives? And maybe the old school approach should die, and effectively we should just embrace this. But there's just one other quick thing I would say, though, that speaks to some of your research, which I think is fascinating as well, about covering these sorts of situations and what role do we play in empathy. I think one of the mistakes that a lot of my industry, especially American television, has done, two things. First of all, you know, we don't put those most impacted on air. Like, we literally don't give them a voice. You'll never see long sound bites in US network TV from people. We never do that. But the most important thing is, I think it's a mistake to think that our own emotions equate to empathy. Like, if a reporter starts crying in a story, the story becomes about the reporter.
Right.
It's actually not about other people suffering. Yeah. So the reporting has to be empathetic, but you don't have to start talking about how I'm such an empath.
Yeah.
You know, sorry, but you don't need to be basically saying that, like, I as an individual am this great empath, and let's all talk about how I was emotionally impacted by this thing that's happening. I think that happens a lot.
Right. Catherine, for you, is getting an outcome something that's important to you? When you're in these crisis zones, do you want to see the conflict end, and do you see your journalism as that it should be geared towards that as a goal?
Yeah, sometimes it gets very, very frustrating, especially when it comes to, crises in Africa. And I'll just give you an example. In the last 4 months, I've covered 4 crises. I've gone to Chad, where there's a crisis between Sudan and Chad. So a lot of thousands of refugees from Sudan have gone to Chad. So we covered that. And then I've done the Democratic Republic of Congo. And now there's another crisis again in South Sudan, again on, what is it called? Not South Sudan, Sudan, right? So there's all that. And every time I go there, all the stories that I'm telling when it comes to these people who've been displaced, it's the same story, just different locations. And over the years, it's the same thing. So my question is that, am I making a big enough impact? Am I making a difference? And that's what frustrates me, because I'm not seeing. Now, I know that there is an impact somehow, but I don't see that impact. So what can I do? How can I tell the stories differently to show that, something is happening? A lot of these refugees and these displaced people that I speak to, they say, okay, fine, so you've come back. I mean, you were here 2 months ago. What has changed? What has happened? I haven't seen anything. So people are asking, these people are asking these questions, and I don't have those answers because I tell them that I'm a journalist. So all I can do is report on this.
Yeah, but that begs the question, why do you keep doing it? If we're reporting and we keep reporting these crises and nothing is changing, what's the point of reporting them? Aren't we engaging in a sort of extractive enterprise where we are going and getting stories and we get paid to do these stories? We make names for ourselves, we make careers for ourselves. But if nothing is changing on the ground, it looks to me very much like we're just extracting and not giving back. So in what sense, what will be then the motivation to keep doing it?
Yeah, I guess it's the exposure, because you cannot say that nothing is happening. I know stuff is happening, right? But as a journalist, I want to see more happening. I want to see, the people that I went to interview in the Democratic Republic of Congo 5 years ago, that something gave, something is happening, right? And we can only do that by creating that exposure, to just continue doing that job, to make sure that whatever international partners or the governments somehow we can put more pressure on these players to do their job, and to make sure that this, and I know that it's very simplistic to say, because there's a lot of interest, a lot of issues when it comes, especially to humanitarian issues, when it comes to people issues as well. So I feel like all we can do is just continue putting the pressure. But as an individual, I feel like it's very frustrating if you're just doing the same thing over and over, because you have players, power players,
right,
who can make these changes, but they're not.
Could I just jump in and say it does really make a difference, just how powerful the good reporting is in the world. And there's a few ways that researchers have tried to look at that. And one is to understand how news coverage leads to more money being given to a crisis. And one researcher estimated that every article in Le Monde leads to $60,000 being given to a crisis. We did a project that showed that lots of coverage on national TV leads governments, genuinely triggers governments to respond more to an emergency crisis. So you've got these kind of practical ways in which quantity of reporting makes a difference. But you've also got a lot of research to show that when you do good ethical reporting that is empathetic and all of the things that you've been talking about, it can genuinely help connect audiences to a distance crisis and feel more empathetic and respectful and involved in a kind of cosmopolitan world. So just thought I'd inject some optimism there.
Yeah, just one thing that I want to add is that when I'm talking about this long, winding crisis, crises that never end.
Right.
And yes, they make an impact, and the different countries donate and make money out of it. But the thing is, because there is a lot of fatigue, all these organizations, all these countries that you're talking about, and we have so many other crises that are coming up. So, that's what I was talking about, these conflicts that never end.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Right. As I said, if you've got a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. Jane, I want to go back to this. Not go back, let me just raise this. The issue of the foreign correspondent. In lots of these crises, at least to international audiences, what they see, in the big international media, there's a tendency to send foreign correspondents to cover crises in other spaces rather than use local journalists, or at least the face of the reporting is quite foreign. And even now you have a push by journalists to get into Gaza, the so-called international journalists get into Gaza as if there are no journalists there already reporting. You were a foreign correspondent. Do you think that there is still space for the institution of foreign correspondent? And if there is, what is that?
Sure. I think that the sort of really clear bias in the past of having a journalist, like this sense that the reporter is supposed to look like, sound like the audience who they're talking to, I think that's largely dying out. It was always something of a fallacy, and the interesting thing is social media really proved that. I remember when I was getting started, I remember the networks beating my Irish-British accent out of me because apparently, so I was literally told to speak with an American accent and being constantly judged on my looks. Now, of course, that had nothing to do with, you know, the much broader impact on people who are local journalists all over the world. But I mean, it just gives you a sense of how absurdly myopic the view of to what we want this person to look like would be. That's TV, obviously, and obviously as a visual medium, that's different. But I think that's largely been laughed out of the room now because ultimately social media has proven that what people want is authenticity. And what could be more authentic than a local journalist telling you what's happening there? There's obviously practical implications now because as news organizations, they cut back on international reporting, they also don't have the resources. So on the one hand, that can lean into the foreign correspondent because they'll say, well, we've got 5 correspondents and we can't afford bureaus in every country. Or do they go more for the freelance model where they would turn to a stringer in that country who most likely should be a local reporter? I think that we're leaning more into the latter now, but at the end of the day, I think it's almost become something of a redundant question as mainstream media declines and dies.
Right. I mean, there was, parachute journalism has gotten a really bad...
No one's got any parachutes anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
But I would say, though, to caveat that, I think there'll always be an appetite for a journal, like for international storytellers, people who travel the world and tell stories. I just don't think it has to be so dominant as it was. I think it'll become the minority. The foreign correspondent, as you or I would know them, who look like me, will become less and less and less, and just be a small specialty.
I think that's absolutely, I think that's already the truth, to be honest, when you look at just the numbers of kind of the global networks and who they hire. I'd maybe add one other caveat, which is that sometimes it's easier to protect someone who's a foreign national if they're reporting on a really complicated autocratic situation, where one thing we need to do much more about and talk more about, I think, is how we can protect local journalists who are risking their lives every day to report on this for an international audience and are much more vulnerable than those more traditional foreign correspondents were, because if something goes wrong, those correspondents just left the country and they had a passport. And in fact, it was like a badge of pride, that they got kicked out of the country. Whereas local journalists, their livelihoods, their family, their physical safety are so much more vulnerable sometimes in some contexts.
Right. Catherine, you are, I guess I'd say, part of a new bunch of African foreign correspondents. You travel around the continent, you cover crisis you're Kenyan, but you're covering crisis in places outside of Kenya. Do you face the kind of same obstacles, the same, would people look at you as sort of Jane in disguise?
I don't think so. So essentially, with Al Jazeera, I'll speak to Al Jazeera. So our correspondents are all African. And that was a conscious decision that was made by Al Jazeera because we need to have African journalists telling their own stories, their own lived experiences. But that, again, can be complicated when it comes to some very sensitive stories. And I'll just give a few examples. For example, in Kenya, there was an issue of terrorism a few years back. And it was very difficult for a Kenyan to tell that story because there was a lot of pushback when it comes to the government, because of course the government did not want us to tell these stories, and some of us decided to stay out of the stories because we were getting threats and things like that. So when something like that happens, and because of the safety, because we live in that country, so now we'd have some correspondents from other parts of the country, from the other parts of the world to come and cover some of the very big happenings, especially when it comes to follow-ups. Of course, when they come here, we would be the one to be given the priority. Like, for example, if there's a terrorist attack, so we would be the face. As a Kenyan, I would be the face of that coverage. But when it becomes very bad for my own safety, I can choose to say, you know what, I'll stay this out because I have a family to protect. And that's some of the problems I think we would face as African journalists, just because of, you know, the bureaucracies and just the government pressure and the security issues as well. So as Al Jazeera, we look into that as well. I can give another example. Right now, I cannot report in the Democratic Republic of Congo because of a story that the government felt was not right for us. So there's a conflict going on right now, but as Kenyans, and that's our part, we cannot report from there to DRC to tell the story that he is obviously very capable of telling. So those are some of the challenges.
Yeah, and that was my point, is that from the start, we say African reporters telling African stories, but Africa is a pretty big place and a very diverse place. So even the word African reporter really has no meaning, you know. So if we're talking really about local reporters doing that, why should we have this bunch of people who move around? I agree with you. I think there is a value of an external perspective, but it shouldn't be the dominant one. You know, the dominant one should be the local one. So I'm wondering whether, like, what Al Jazeera is doing even by hiring you is simply replicating a model that we really need to rethink and to say that this, you know, let local people tell their own stories.
I would say, though, just a small response to that, though, that I think is important. Like, I do think that we remember that journalism is a trade, right? It is a set of skills, right. And it may be simply, we need way more investment in journalism schools in every country, because, there are many countries where there's great local talent that's not being utilized, but at the end of the day, there may be, there's always hierarchies, and it may be that some of the top regional reporters end up in Nairobi, and, and so there's a balance there to be had. What you're getting at is integrity of of being from a place, but balancing that with the incredible experience and skills of a reporter who's worked for like a massive TV station or newspaper in Nairobi. It's kind of like the balance I think a lot of news organizations are looking for.
Right. There's a question from a lady there.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is to the two journalists. Do you think it's worth sometimes re-traumatizing people in order to get the story, when the story sometimes just becomes part of the background noise, particularly in Africa, where people believe, largely in the West, that wars just happen on a daily basis in Africa and there's actually nothing new? And even as you're trying to bring about exactly what it means for these people and trying to create that empathy and potentially that, the funding that comes with it, people aren't left unscathed by these interactions that they have with journalists. Is it worth it, I guess would be the question, because I'm starting to doubt whether it is. I'm not a journalist. And I have one question for you, which is, do you think that, not to go into the psychoanalysis of it, but do you think that the sort of hero archetype that sometimes you see in some journalists, which is similar to what you see in soldiers and similar to what you see in aid workers, impacts some of the ways in which they tell the story? Because sometimes I do feel that the story does become very much about the journalist. I don't want to name any names, but there are very prominent journalists for whom every story becomes about them, and not just because of their notoriety or the celebrity status, but the whole manner in which they approach journalism. So if you can answer that.
Okay, Catherine, do you take that?
Yeah.
The first part at least.
I think you talked about re-traumatizing, and this is something that I think we've talked about for a very long time, especially where I am from, and this kind of stuff that I cover when it comes to talking to people who are so traumatized, who are in distress. And I'll just give an example. I'll just give an example. A few years ago, there was a famine in Somalia, and there's one correspondent who had just started out, and she came to Kenya to cover this story, and I was a producer then, and we went to a place in northern Kenya called Dadaab, where thousands of people were coming to seek safety and also to look for food. And we were interviewing these people who had just arrived. I mean, they were so dusty, they were so tired. They had lost their loved ones as well. We spoke to a woman, for example, who lost 4 kids in that journey, right? But when we were doing the interview, there was no emotion. So we're trying to talk to her, we're trying to interview her, and my correspondent at the time was like, oh my God, we have such a powerful story. But there was no emotion. And then she's getting frustrated because she's trying to get the emotions to get the story out. And then we started now, asking her what happened over and over and over and over. And that, I think that was one of my lowest moments as a journalist, because she couldn't understand. Like, I've already told you. And when you talk about re-traumatizing, there's a lot of that going on. And again, it needs experience. It needs not just empathy, but you also need the ethics. And a lot of people come in with, I have to get the story out. But you have to know that these people are human, and they have gone through so much. There's different ways of telling the story without re-traumatizing these people.
And is that something that journalists are prepared for when they go into these crisis zones to interview people? Tiana Stevens in Australia has done a survey, or did a survey, some research on interviewing people who'd survived the genocide in Bosnia, and she gives these examples of people who have been, everybody sees a nice sort of compelling story, and you have a flock of journalists and they all want to interview the same person, and over, this person is just being, subjected to this. And I wonder whether journalists are actually trained before you go into these places. These are some of the things you need to think about. These are some of the ethical issues you need to think about. Or do they just turn up green? And I know the second part of your question will come to that, but I wanted to hear your answer.
I think you raise a good point there. I think you can only do so much training. Ultimately, not re-traumatizing someone, and in answer to your question, it's never worth re-traumatizing someone. But having a conversation with someone about what has happened to them isn't automatically re-traumatizing them. Like, that you don't have to re-traumatize someone to hear their story every time. It totally depends on how vulnerable the person is in that moment, and how you approach it. But I would say, unfortunately, it takes a lot of experience. You can't really foolproof train a young reporter and know they'll never overstep, because learning to recognize trauma that's too raw, or like what you're describing, someone who has this totally dissociated coping mechanism, and trying to break down that coping mechanism just so you can get tears on camera, like recognizing it's not that this woman is indifferent to her 4 dead children, it's like this is the only way she's able to survive.
But being able to recognize
understanding that takes experience. I actually wrote about this in my book. When I was in Afghanistan, I had a producer who was a highly experienced producer who had done no work in war zones, and she couldn't understand why people weren't crying more.
Right.
And she didn't understand that, people had no access to any support. So they had developed a resilience that did not mirror America. And, you know, people were not showing emotion because this is how they survived. I think understanding that and respecting that, and it makes less interesting TV and being okay with that.
Okay, we're running out of time, so you'll take
it's a great question about
we have another
kind of hero mentality of foreign correspondents. I think absolutely, well, first I'd caveat by saying that I kind of interviewed hundreds of foreign correspondents, and they are overwhelmingly really great humans, like who are smart, who are passionate, interested in the world and want to do good. So I think that's the case. But I think the system that operates does create these kind of hero narratives that can be both problematic and good. So problematic when it's parachute journalism that then sucks up resources and sends someone that doesn't understand into the field because they think that's this famous celebrity. You know, you could talk to news organizations on the ground where journalists were so frustrated when Nelson Mandela was sick, because it's a terrible example, but news organizations kept paying loads of money every time he got sick to send their fancy, famous journalists to South Africa. Meanwhile, they had no budget to report on conflict and crises, you know, around the continent and around the world. So that's bad. It's also bad when it pushes out local voices, and you think of the famous Michael Burke reporting on the Ethiopian famine, or at least famous in the United Kingdom, an 8-minute or so long news report on a horrific famine, not a single local voice in the whole piece, just this white man mediating the suffering for the audience. That's bad. But I would say, and I think we need to address this a lot more going forward, because this is the questions around influencers and content production, and actually you can engage with the audience well when you are a known, trusted, this question of credibility, a really great source. And I think, you know, when someone like Lise Doucette comes on the news, I'm like, well, she probably knows what she's talking about. She knows loads about Afghanistan. She's going to tell me something I trust. Or people that, you know, you think about Mary Colvin or foreign correspondents that you loved, and then they could connect with their audience. So I think, you know, it's a complex one, definitely bad stuff, but we need to think about it quite a lot more, because it's definitely the future of engaging with audiences is a kind of more interpersonal relationship.
Okay, let's take...
Right. Hi, I was taught to stand up, so I will do so. And just quickly on that point, I should add, there's an organization called the Dart Center, if you don't know them. Last week I was in a workshop in Paris specifically looking on trauma reporting, and actually they have some very fixed and very well thought out guidelines on how to do that in order to not cause re-traumatizing. And some of them are actually here at the festival. I can give you the contact. Anyway, so my name is Peter Young. I'm a freelance reporter. And yes, all of this subject is, I've done a lot of sort of foreign reporting, going through this kind of existential crisis now with what is my role and how can I do this in a non-extractive way. I should note that I've written for both Al Jazeera and Humanitarian. But I would just be interested to know your thoughts on helping to outline when, and I should say I don't tend to do crisis reporting, but still foreign reporting, but at what line can we sort of distinguish, you know, when should I have a role? You know, I do think I have some talents that I can offer and report on stories that I think I could add value on. So for example, I was actually in Kenya in September, and in efforts to not being extractive, worked with a local reporter, co-published with The Nation, one of the largest newspapers in Kenya, but and yeah, and generally trying to be as non-extractive as possible. But I just wonder if you have any sort of basic guidelines or advice on whether, as media outlets, you have sort of hard lines on whether you should be using outside reporters or not, or any broader advice. Thank you.
Speaking for the New Humanitarian, one of our guidelines is we prefer local reporters, but we do use people who can get to spaces at times. But I think we are also, as I said, this is part of a discussion that we are getting into about how do we cover crisis better. You know, a part of our commitment is to decolonize our journalism, you know, so to actually reflect more local perspectives rather than sort of the perspective of the outsider coming in to tell other people's stories. But I don't know, Mel, whether you've got thoughts on that?
I believe very strongly that we want a mixed ecology of reporting. So I don't think I would ever say one rule for who should and shouldn't do reporting. We want lots of reporting by as many people as possible. I think you're more self-aware than most people talking about this issue, so you know that, you know, you're partnering with local news organizations. That's great. And, you know, hopefully being thoughtful about the context in which you're working. Yeah, I don't think I would suggest there should be a hard and fast rule about that, other than kind of do no harm and be mindful that the one big shift I would say that's happened is that international news is consumed a lot locally now, and that's a shift that I think international news organisations haven't properly grappled with. So you have to be much more mindful of your local audience than you were in the past. So I think that's also just an important consideration.
Okay, we've run out of time, so thanks a lot for coming for this. I hope it was useful, and we'll catch up. We can have a chat outside.